Hello, so we have about half of the chapter on emotions left to finish. So I'm just going to do basically half a lecture here, and then in the future we'll do the full chapter, but you should have the notes from the few classes before break. So I believe where we left off, we finished talking about emotional expression and the individual emotions. And so there are individual differences in how much emotion individuals express. A lot of these differences are rooted in temperament. So associations with temperament suggest that biological factors really play a central role in how intensely children experience emotions, as well as how they regulate emotions. Okay, but it's also important to talk about how kids recognize emotions in other people. And so by ages 3 to 6 months, babies are exposed to their parents' and caregivers' facial expressions of emotions, and infants learn to recognize some emotions. And one of the big patterns that we see is they recognize positive emotions earlier than negative. So if we think about kind of the purpose of that, we can kind of go back to some of those theoretical perspectives we talked about in the beginning of the chapter. The functionalist perspective basically argues that positive emotion is rewarding and it strengthens the infant-caregiver bond, where negative emotions requires coping abilities which young infants don't have. The learning perspective argues that kind of these early experiences affect kids' ability to recognize emotions. Most infants have generally more experience with positive emotions compared to negative emotions, and this is why they recognize them earlier, but of course the kind of interactions that kids have with their parents is going to be influenced by this. Okay. In terms of the development of emotion recognition, most children can recognize and label other people's emotional expressions of some of these primary emotions by ages 3 to 4. They have a pretty sophisticated understanding. They can use language to explain and understand emotions. By around age 3, they are better at identifying the causes of happy versus sad emotions, but by 4, they have a pretty good understanding of negative events as well. And a lot of these are tested by kind of giving kids a story or a drawing and asking them to identify the emotion that a character feels. And in school age, we see increased understanding of kind of mixed emotions, and even kind of that you might feel happy and excited at the same time, or even more incompatible emotions like having a happy memory but feeling sad that the person is gone. An emotional script is a schema that enables kids to identify the emotional reaction that likely accompanies a particular event. So kind of we know that we feel happy at birthday parties. So by ages 3 to 4, kids can really identify situations that lead to specific emotions. They know that, we generally feel happy when we're playing, we feel sad when we're angry, those kinds of things. At age 5, they can understand situations that lead to particular emotions, and also specific facial displays of behaviors. And then at age 7, they can describe situations that elicit more complicated emotions with no obvious facial or behavioral expressions. So they get a little bit better at understanding what people might be feeling, whether or not they can actually see it on their faces. Okay, so this is kind of the trajectory of how kids go through understanding multiple emotions, so feeling mixed emotions, and also having multiple causes of the same emotion. I'll let you go through this on your own. Okay, next is emotion regulation, which is how kids manage and monitor and modify their emotions in terms of intensity and the duration of the arousal. So how do they manage the feelings, the physiological reactions, the cognitions, the behavior? So if we take like the example from the hostile attribution bias, where you have a kid that spills milk all over you, your first reaction might be anger, but if you fight him, they might hurt you. So you have to kind of dampen your anger, your feelings, you have to modify your arousal, the physiology, and you have to kind of think about what could happen and choose the behavior. So being able to regulate emotions improves kids' feelings. It makes them feel more positively. It increases the likelihood that other people will respond positively to children, and it's associated with maturation of the prefrontal cortex, which is why we may see some issues with emotion regulation in teenage years as well. Before birth, you can actually see signs of emotion regulation. So, for example, fetuses in ultrasounds, you can see them sucking their thumbs, which is a sign of self-soothing. And very young infants use very simplistic tactics. So, around the newborn stage, it's entirely regulated by adults. So, caregivers rocking, soothing, rubbing their back, things like that. By 6 months, though, you see infants lessening negative arousal by avoiding negative stimuli or looking for parents to comfort them. And by a year, they start doing their own thing. So rocking, chewing on objects, moving away from people. They really have a little better sense. In terms of preschool, we can see kids using things like self-distraction, orienting their attention away from a stimulus, and also using language skills to regulate those emotions. So they can talk about the negative emotions and how to deal with them. They know that they can distract themselves from emotions. And a lot of these lessons are kind of scaffolded by the parents. The child internalizes them and then they do it on their own. And then as we get to elementary school, you get kind of a much broader range of the kinds of strategies and self-regulation skills that kids have. And they can be both cognitive as well as behavioral. Display rules have to do with kind of how and when we express emotions. And so there's a lot of cultural differences in this. But children learn about display rules even before they're necessarily proficient at regulating their own display. So this is when, kids need to fake an emotion. So they have to replace a genuine emotion with what they're expected to feel. There are certainly differences in gender and culture in terms of this. Generally, collectivist cultures place more of an emphasis on maintaining social harmony and social order. But younger preschoolers tend to just kind of exaggerate or minimize their emotional displays. But by 8 to 10, they can display emotion other than the one that they actually feel. So there are, of course, individual differences in emotion regulation. A lot of this is driven by temperament, especially kids who are temperamentally reactive and are bad at controlling their attention, are poor emotion regulators. And there's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that emotion regulation predicts children's later adjustment. So I've got the link here and I've got it on Moodle as well, to the marshmallow test, which is a test of essentially emotion regulation, asking kids to wait and delay gratification and seeing kind of what they do in the process. They get 1 marshmallow now, or if they sit in front of a marshmallow and don't touch it for 15 minutes, they'll get 2. And evidence shows that those kids who are better at regulating their emotions during the marshmallow test go on to have better self-regulation and more success as adults. Okay, so in terms of how we learn emotions, this is a process called emotion socialization, and it leads to changes in understanding and expression of emotions, which lead to changes in kind of social competence and ability to regulate emotion. But we see socialization of modeling of emotions, reactions to emotions, and coaching of emotions, and that affects how much we understand them and how much we express them. And those things combined are really what lead to our emotion regulation. Children learn a lot about positive emotion expression and emotion regulation by observing and interacting with parents. And there are certainly positive correlations between parent and child expressiveness. And when parents scold or punish their children for expressing emotions, especially negative emotions, children tend to have more difficulty regulating their emotions. So parents can actually actively kind of coach their kids in emotion regulation and understanding this. There's a couple different aspects associated with this. So just parents noticing their kids' emotions, recognizing expression as kind of an opportunity for teaching, listening with empathy and kind of validating the kids' feelings, labeling emotions so that kids can really understand them, and then helping them figure out how to solve the problem. And there's a lot of evidence that this makes a difference. So parent-child interactions improve emotional understanding. So even things like emotion memories and recognizing discrete emotions, highlighting events that cause certain emotions. These are the kinds of things that parents do that really teach kids about emotions. And part of this comes from elaborative dialogue. So having open-ended questions with detailed explanations, this is what leads to better emotional understanding. And parents can also help kids learn about emotions by kind of reminiscing about emotional experiences together. So just talking about something that made them happy or something that made them sad helps kids learn about emotions. Kids are also socialized about emotions by their peers, right? So we've talked about already the fact that there's equal power in peer relationships, and this can really help with perspective taking and increasing the motivation just to understand other people's emotions. Peer reactions teaches kids the consequence of expressing negative or positive emotions, right? If a peer is a really negative reaction to someone being angry, it teaches kids maybe I need to hold that in a little bit. Peers can also just kind of help kids improve their emotional understanding by watching someone else your own age go through something. And engage in pretend play with siblings and friends can help kids learn about other people's feelings by putting them in different situations. Teachers are another agent of socialization. So we have, especially in preschool, emotional learning is a really important part of school readiness. With toddlers, a lot of it is physical comfort and distraction to help them regulate those negative emotions. With preschoolers, it's more about kind of providing them with the language they need to help them understand the causes and expressions of negative emotions. That final section in the book really talks about depression as kind of an example of when emotions go wrong. This is really the most common emotional problem in childhood. So depression is a mood disorder that is manifested in a sad mood, a loss of interest in familiar activities, but sometimes it manifests differently in kids compared to adults. So one of the biggest differences is the dominant mood is often irritability and crankiness rather than sadness, which is common in adults. But it can also interfere with appetite and eating. It might impair their ability to think or concentrate. You also might have kind of somatic complaints like headache and stomach ache. And so depression is relatively rare in childhood, and sometimes it's difficult to diagnose because it looks so different. But like in adulthood, it's more common in girls than boys, but we really see an increase in depression diagnosis in adolescence. And of course, one of the biggest risks or consequences of depression is suicide. Depression or suicide is the second leading cause of adolescent and young adult mortality. And so we need to think about kind of how we can address depression, if for nothing else than to prevent suicide. So in terms of causes of depression, we can break them down into a couple of categories. There are biological causes. So childhood depression is more likely in children who have clinically depressed parents. Depression is associated with brain functions, and often it's difficult to kind of tease apart, is this driven by genetics or is it driven by environmental contributions? One of those reasons is because we know depression can be caused by social causes as well, and in particular, impaired relationships with depressed parents. If parents aren't there and providing that secure attachment, it can create problems and lead to childhood depression. But peer influences like peer rejection, we know, and victimization can be associated with childhood depression, as well as any other life stressors. Depression is often also associated with faulty cognition. So two of the most common ones, learned helplessness is this feeling that the belief that one cannot control the events of the world. Doesn't matter how hard I try, I'm always going to fail on my test. It doesn't matter if I reach out to new peers, they're always going to dislike me. So this leads to feelings of depression. Likewise, attributions of failure, in terms of how much you blame your shortcomings on yourself versus external factors, and that can contribute to depression as well. In terms of treating childhood depression, antidepressant drugs like Prozac and Zoloft are widely prescribed and somewhat effective, but they're used with a lot of caution in childhood and particularly adolescence, because there's some evidence that they can actually increase the risk for suicide. So they should be used with a lot of caution. I think the general, more recommended course of treatment is cognitive behavior therapy. Cognitive behavior therapy really focuses on kind of teaching kids and adolescents strategies for dealing with depressive moods and kind of getting a more positive outlook. So it addresses some of those cognitive causes. Well, are you sure that if every single time you try, you will absolutely fail? That's not actually the case. Let's think of some examples in which you've succeeded. Things like that. All right, so that is the end of the emotions chapter, and I hope you all have a good week.